Hi, I'm Jess Kulik, and as Lacey said, I am one of her coworkers, and I've met most of you at Tuesday Group and at other town events throughout the last year that I've lived in Ely. And today I'm going to talk about the executive functioning and how community supports our ability to increase our executive functioning skills and participate in the events that create our community. So first, I'm going to explain a little bit about myself. Many of you have heard these pieces before, but just a quick synopsis that I moved to Ely in 2023, about a year ago. And I was diagnosed with autism about 3 years ago. And I'm a former teacher. I taught special ed, gen ed, bilingual in second grade through eighth grade at different times, not all at the same time. And I am getting a PhD in developmental psychology. I study how executive dysfunction impacts social skills and relationship challenges for people with ADHD and autism. So that's specifically what I'm researching. Executive functioning, not meaning like you're an executive of a company, but more the day-to-day things that happen in your brain that help you function throughout your day, which I will define in a few minutes further. So today's plan, which you're going to see this slide numerous times because it's going to help keep my brain on track, is to talk about what is neurodivergence, because specifically that is what I study, and how executive dysfunction is a piece of that neurodivergence. So that's the first two things we're going to cover. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what do divergent brains need and how are they different than neurotypical brains? And then how does Ely make a community space that is welcoming and accepting to neurodivergent brains? What specifically does Ely do in order to allow people who are divergent to exist in success here in this community? So many of you know this also, but to help kind of define the neurodivergence, we're going to talk about my specific form of neurodivergence because it helps to have those more concrete examples. And so my autism profile is defined as level 1 hyperlexic hyperverbal with dyscalculia, which is a lot of words. So to start off, autism is a neurodevelopmental disability that has lifelong effects across many different spaces of your life, such as communication, social skills, learning styles, sensory issues, patterns of thought and behavior. And one thing that is important is that thoughts are behavior. This is an important piece of autism and understanding autism, is that what happens in your head is still a function of your behavior. It's just internal behavior rather than external behavior. Many of my autistic traits are internalized in my head, which is why when I tell people I'm autistic, they say, I would have never guessed. That's because you're not inside my brain. Level 1 is that I can accommodate myself most of the time, or I can interact with minimal accommodations. A lot of those accommodations come from my husband or my parents or somebody that knows me very well will often do the accommodations for me. So you often don't notice because I can do minimal accommodations. There's level 1, level 2 is moderate accommodations. Level 3 is severe accommodations where you are not able to be independent most of the time. Hyperlexic is the next piece of my profile, which is that I have an advanced ability to comprehend words, essentially. I'm very good at words. I know a lot of words. I like to read. I read very fast and comprehend very easily. And that's essentially what you need to know about hyperlexia. Then I have hyperverbalism, which is the other reason why nobody ever knows that I'm autistic, because I talk, and I talk a lot. All the time. And the thing about the hyperverbalism is it actually relates a lot to sensory issues. When I am dysregulated, one of the easiest ways for me to regulate is to talk. Because when I have thoughts in my head, if I am not talking, that does not mean the words are stopping inside my brain. They are, in fact, constant, never ending. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and there are thousands of thoughts in my brain already there that I thought about all night. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and there's fewer. One thing like that Tim does often, and you'll see this, is that when he starts noticing that I'm getting stressed, he will ask me a question that he knows will make me rant. And that will calm me right down, because getting the thoughts out of my head is like, the bees buzzing around getting calmer. And that is physically what it feels like when I try to keep the thoughts inside my head. Sometimes I FaceTime my mom to do that because Tim is unfortunately a teacher and is unavailable throughout the day. Not unfortunately that he's a teacher, just unfortunately for me that I can't call him when I want to. So instead I call my mom, who's retired and has plenty of time to answer the phone when I call. You can ask her about it. She's sitting back there. She loves it. It's her favorite thing. Then the last piece of my autism profile is my dyscalculia. Dyscalculia is like dyslexia, think of dyslexia, but with math and numbers. So I don't comprehend numbers the way that many of you do. Some of you might comprehend them the way I do. In my brain, numbers are shapes and colors, and they're not physical numbers. When I look at an analog clock, I see days of the week and colors. That's how my brain comprehends it. And so it's very hard for me to read analog clocks and tell you what time it is, which is why I brought my phone here so that I can tap it and make sure I'm not using up too much time, because I can't understand what that clock says. Any time is fake anyway, so it is what it is. But it also affects my ability to process like money at times. Like I'm very careful when I'm counting out money when I'm paying for something, because I know that the numbers are different in my brain than they are in other people's. It can also affect my ability to understand spatial awareness, like putting leftovers away. If you ask me to put leftovers away, I can't tell what size container will work until I try them, because my brain can't process that. My part of dyscalculia has a visual spatial deficiency. I do not see things in my mind at any point. I only hear words. And so it's hard for me to visualize, like, how would I pack a car? Things like that. And so a lot of the accommodations that I receive from my loved ones are that I don't do many of those things. Like I don't pack the car, or I don't put the leftovers away, because I make a lot of extra dishes when I try. And Tim gets tired of that. So from there, let's talk a little bit more broadly about what exactly neurodivergence is and how all of those pieces fit into it. There's generally these 4 different categories of neurodivergence, according to most current research. And if you have read my sweatshirt, as many of you have, my hobbies are excessive research followed by info dumping at people what I just learned. And so I keep up with a lot of the current research through journal articles, which my PhD gives me access to, thankfully. And so you start with the developmental disorders like ADHD, autism, Down syndrome, intellectual disabilities. And then there's also some mental health disorders that fall into this category, like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, some types of anxiety. And then there's also a few medical conditions that affect not only your body, but also your development of your brain. And then finally, addictive brains, trauma, and other learning disabilities are kind of fitting into this other category at the moment, because there's some research to suggest that addictive brains and brains that have been severely traumatized are structurally and chemically different. And that's what's really important here, is that neurodivergent brains don't structurally develop or chemically develop the same as a neurotypical brain. When you do brain scans of a neurotypical brain and a neurodivergent brain, they look different in the scans. And the chemical pathways, when you provide dye and you look at like how are people thinking, what parts of their brains are lighting up, it lights up differently. Some of the most recent research on autism and ADHD indicates that autistic brains never prune. When you're born with all of the neurons that you will ever have in your life. And from about right after you're born, about 2 weeks up through adulthood, your brain is pruning, is getting rid of the ones that you don't need. It's saying, we don't need these neurons anymore, we've never used them. If you've seen Inside Out, it's kind of like when they're taking the memories and they're throwing them away into that pit. That's what your brain's doing for most of your life. However, autistic brains don't do that. They never prune. So they never lose any neurons, which means that there's about 20% more gray matter in an autistic brain as compared to a neurotypical brain. And it means that there's connections in places where they shouldn't be. And so when you think about the profile that I just talked about with the hyperverbalism, when my brain has to keep those words inside my head, it's physical pain at times, because there's connections in places that there shouldn't be connections. When you see an autistic person who hears a loud noise and they have a physical reaction, that's because there's connections in places where there shouldn't be connections, and that noise causes physical pain to their body because there's too many connections that are happening. You can contrast that with ADHD brains, which also do not go through a pruning process the way that neurotypical brains do. But the ADHD brains don't have connections in between all of the different sections. So ADHD brains create these little tunnels, which is why they have that like fast moving effect. And they make connections really quickly because they're going through these underground subway systems in their brain to get to the same place that you would be getting to at a neurotypical or an autistic space. And it's also why ADHD brains will be on a track and then all of a sudden shoot off, and to you it seems unconnected, but it is, because in their brain they're in their subway system. and the train took a turn. So this is, and these pieces are important as you talk about like the experiences of how the executive dysfunction plays a role in your day-to-day life. But essentially, to sum it up, neurodivergent individuals struggle with differences in mental function, in their sensory processing, in their learning styles, their behavior, and their communication. And so it's across all parts of your life. It impacts every section of your day. There is never a point where you're not neurodivergent. You can't just take a break from it. Even when you're sleeping, like even when I'm sleeping, my brain is thinking. There are times when it feels like my body slept and my brain didn't, and I wake up and I can tell Tim all kinds of things that my brain processed in the night, and he gets overwhelmed. But you know, he's good about dealing with that, I guess. So he's never complained explicitly. Yeah, I know he is on Zoom. He texted me. He's probably laughing. So back to today's plan, because we're keeping my brain on track. So we're going to keep this slide in here periodically and make sure that I'm moving along. My brain will go off on tangents without it. Well, what is executive dysfunction? That's the next thing we need to talk about. Specifically, how does executive dysfunction play a role in neurodivergent individuals? Executive functioning is the way that you interact with your environment, essentially. Every single thing that your brain does, because remember, thinking is behavior, every single thing that your brain does is wrapped up in executive functioning skills. The way you organize your physical space, the way you organize your thoughts, plans that you make, the your working memory, how do you retrieve things that you've been trying to remember? What kind of reflection processes? Are you able to reflect on what you did recently or not? Any of your cognitive functionality can be in here, and cognitive flexibility. So if plans change, can you flexibly move around those plans? Spoiler alert, I can't. And then inhibition control. So like impulsivity and making sure that you're staying on the plan that you came up with. And the foundation of executive functioning is emotional regulation. When you think about a toddler and their tantrums, they do not have emotional regulation skills yet. Their brain has not developed enough to be able to emotionally regulate themselves. So they have tantrums because these emotions are big and their bodies are tiny and they come out whether we want them to or not. When you see those tantrums, that's a toddler processing through their emotions and trying to learn and understand how to regulate. Once you've figured out that emotional regulation piece, you can access the rest of these. But if you're not emotionally regulated, you're not going to be planning your day. You're not going to be flexible when plans change. Your memory is not going to work. We've all had that time where we're so angry or we're so frustrated or we're overcome with grief and we can't remember what's going on in our lives and in our world, because our brains need that emotional regulation to allow us access to these adulthood executive functioning skills. When you think about on social media, when people talk about like, oh, I'm adulting today and I'm going to the bank, this is what they're doing. They're executively functioning, because you know most of us don't want to make a phone call all the time. We avoid it. And so then we have to override our emotional regulation and executively function. And as adults, that's what we expect. But you have to develop those skills. So basically, it's how you interact with your day. It's how you plan your day. It's how you interact with people. It's how you feel about your day. It's how you process every single thing that goes on. However, if you are a neurodivergent individual, you may not have the ability to executively function, at least not all the time. And this is kind of where the cornerstone of my research comes in, because things like getting up in the morning and leaving the house for work. I asked my husband one time, because I saw a TikTok and I was like, now I'm curious. So I asked him, what do you think about when you're getting ready in the morning, like brushing your teeth and getting ready to leave and go to work? And you know what he said? Nothing. He just does it. I was like, how do you remember? Like, how do you think about what steps you do? How do you think about like getting out of bed and going to brush your teeth? And he said, I don't know, I just do it. I love him so much. And yet I am so confused by that, because, and he knows this, we've had this conversation many times, so he can hear it on Zoom. I have to think about every single thing I do. When my eyes open in the morning, I make a conscious decision to turn off my alarm. I make a conscious decision to get my Kindle. I make a conscious decision to get out of bed. When I go to get ready in the morning, I think, okay, first I'm brushing my teeth. Then I'm doing this. And by the way, there's a system for how I brush my teeth. So even that's not on autopilot. I think about how many strokes I do in each section of my teeth. And like when you're neurodivergent, everything you do is manual. Why? I can tell you a lot about that research. It's actually really fascinating, but I'm not going to go down that tangent. I am going to say though that autistic and ADHD brains in particular, but most neurodivergent brains, their cerebellum in the back of their brain doesn't develop the same way structurally and doesn't connect to the other parts of their brain. Your cerebellum is what allows you to have habits that are autopilot. And if your cerebellum doesn't develop properly in your ADHD or autistic in particular, but they're finding this with other neurodivergence as well, guess what? Nothing's ever automatic. You think about everything, every single step you take, every single word you say, every thought in your head, every action, every reaction, everything ends up being manual. And if you've driven a manual car, which I do not know how to do effectively, but I have tried, it takes thought. There's multiple things happening at one time. And there's multiple dependencies, right? There's multiple sections of like, if this happens, then this happens. And that's what neurodivergent brains are doing every single second of every day. So looking at like coming home from work and transitioning to housework. When I walk in the door and I have to think about dishes need to be done, laundry needs to be done. And then you're thinking and planning in your head, how long are these tasks going to take? What amount of energy do I have to expend to do these tasks? How much can I handle in this moment? What needs to get done versus what can be put off for tomorrow? What do I need to talk to my partner about? All of those things are individual tasks. There's this really great tool called Goblin Tools. You can search it online and you can type in any task and then you hit the little magic wand and it shows you every single individual discrete task that is part of the main task you put in. So like, if you've ever had to explain to somebody how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, this was something we had to do in school often because they wanted to show how many steps go into it. It's not, for neurodivergent brains, it's not get peanut butter, get bread, get jelly. It's get the knife, open the peanut butter, get the bread, pull out bread. Like it's every single thing. And that makes your brain tired because it can't rely on autopilot. And so making plans to going out with friends, going to town events, spending time in public, all of those pieces are at play. How many of you woke up today, thought, oh yeah, it's Tuesday group, and then when the clock got to a certain time, you said, I'm gonna get in my car and drive to Tuesday group. And then that was the end of that task. That's all you did. If I don't know how to park at a place, if I don't know what the parking situation is gonna be, I might not even go. Because when you pull into a parking lot, they're all different somehow. Why is that? It's like a microwave. Every microwave should look the same and operate the same, and they don't. And it just bothers me. It's so when I have to think about like, where am I gonna park? How am I gonna get there? Once I park, which door do I walk into? Do I need to greet people as I walk in the door? Am I gonna be shaking hands with them or just like waving? What kind of situation are we talking about here? Are people gonna hug me? Do I need to be like prepared for that? Are people going to be like wanting to ask me specific questions? All of these things are going through my head. And then I'm having to backtrack and figure out like what time I should leave. And today is a great example of how my executive functioning skills failed me. Because Lacey and I were at the office together and we talked about me leaving to come here. And she said, I'm gonna go, but you have plenty of time. And then I remembered that I had to put gas in the car. And for some reason, my brain decided that if I did not leave at, I think it was like 10:50, I had to leave. I don't even know what time it was because I rarely look at the clock. But if I did not leave in that moment, I was going to be late for this presentation. I got here at 11:10. But my brain thought that task was going to take significantly longer than it did. Also, I pulled into the gas station the wrong way because my brain couldn't read the arrow on the car. But all of those things add up in a day. And you get to the end of the day and you're tired. And you're thinking, I can't go tomorrow. I can't go to whatever events are happening. I'm too tired already. And that executive functioning demand starts to eat away at pieces of your life, right? And so executive dysfunction in many people can look like freezing. It can look like I'm getting stuck. This is my preferred method, honestly, in public, is to just kind of freeze up and be really quiet and then like look around a lot and not have anything to say for a minute. If I'm not talking, that's probably concerning. Over functioning is another piece of executive dysfunction where you start getting like over controlling of your schedule. And you start thinking like, I have to do everything exactly the way that's planned at exactly these times. or you do like more than you need to do in a day. And that's extra tiring because you really should be resting. Everybody needs rest. Isolation is another piece of executive dysfunction when you just get to a point where you're like, I can't handle going out in public anymore because of how many steps my brain has to go through. And the last one of forgetfulness, of you're starting to forget meetings, or you forget to bring things to meetings, or you forget that this task is due. And then what's hard about all four of these things is the guilt. I'm aware when I'm in a bad executive dysfunction state, and nobody is more aware than me of how that impacts the people around me. And it ends up with you feeling like you're a burden, which makes you further pull into these spaces because you feel like, how can I come and participate without putting my needs on those around me? They shouldn't have to accommodate me. And the problem is that getting out of executive dysfunction usually requires accommodation from outside sources. It requires community. It requires people that can help you and encourage you and hold you accountable in gentle and caring ways. But when we're in this state, we can't access that. And when you're somebody like me who didn't get diagnosed until she was 30, I knew most of my life that something was different. I used to tell people and like my therapists and stuff that I felt like I was in this glass box and I could see everybody else acting normal and interacting, but I couldn't figure out how to get there. And they could come up and talk to me in my little box because there was a window, I could open the window, but I couldn't leave. I couldn't be in that because I was different somehow. And I felt that for a long time. And so when I got diagnosed when I was 30, I went through an entire round of neuropsych testing, and then I had a doctor and also another psychiatrist all work with me during this time to find out what was going on. And they all agreed I'm definitely this new profile of hyperverbal autistic. But that explained so many pieces of why I struggled my whole life, why I had one friend, why I read in my room most of my life instead of participating in things, why I didn't show up to stuff. Even if I was explicitly invited, why couldn't I go? And why didn't I feel okay once I got there? Those pieces all come from this over-functioning, this isolation, this freeze response of not understanding how my brain needs to operate. So that leads us to, what do divergent brains need? How do they start accessing that community and participating again? So tip number one, clear and direct communication. Many of you have figured this out. I will talk. You will ask me a question. I will talk about several things, go off on many tangents. You need to tell me, I need you to stop. Like, look me in the face and say, I have to go. I won't be offended. You can ask my mom. She does it all the time. I won't be offended by people looking at me directly and saying that. I'm also not offended when I'm behind on tasks and Linda or Andrea from AUW are like, are you going to send the email for this Northland Gathering thing or not? And it's very direct. And I'm not offended by that. And I'm like, oh yes, you're right. I did forget that. Thank you. I'm not, and this is true for most people with neurodivergence. Body language is a nightmare for me. Everybody uses it slightly differently. And it can be really hard to interpret because we use some similar gestures and similar body language for multiple emotions. So it's not easy always, even if you're not neurodivergent, to comprehend and understand what people's bodies are saying. And 80% of communication in our society is nonverbal. That's awful. We should not be doing that. But you know, we're here, we're Minnesota nice, so we don't say things directly all the time. And one thing that I'm here to say is that oftentimes it's a lot more polite to just say it directly than to wait and try to see if they'll figure it out. Another tip is that reminders and space for follow-up questions. I need to ask a lot of questions a lot of the time. So if you give me some space to ask those questions, because I want to make sure I am accurate on my information. I don't need to be right, but I do need to be accurate. And so if I have inaccurate information, that's physical pain. But also I want, like, if I'm not getting the task done, or I have forgotten, or I misinterpreted a deadline, reminders are great. We all could use reminders. We all have days where things get out of hand. We all have days where we wake up and the day has already run away from us by the time we get out of bed. And so just gentle reminders, working in communities are great at this. Ely is great at the reminders, actually. My favorite thing is body doubling. That's tip number 3. It's like the buddy system. You can co-regulate. Kids do this all the time. When you were, if you were a parent and you had a small child and they were having a hard time, you hugged them generally, right? Like, or sat with them, or, had some kind of physical contact, and or like just were in the room with them. I just this morning was talking to my mom about how I was like having a meltdown. It was a whole thing. And I referenced that this is what happened when I would need to clean my room. You know what? She would sit in my room. She'd just sit there. She didn't really clean it. She just sat there. Now Tim does that. He brings his Switch into wherever I'm working and sits there, because having that person near me that I can kind of draw off of their energy a little bit and off of their emotions. As teachers, we have this saying that when the class is chaotic, when kids are chaotic, you don't join their chaos, you share your calm. And as a teacher, you know that you decide what the emotions of the room are. You have to walk in and know and decide that. And then you have to create those emotions for the class. And that's body doubling. That's giving your regulation away, basically, in small amounts. And it's very helpful for anyone who is having a struggle. Empathy, there's that video where like the giraffe drops into the hole and sits next to the rabbit or whatever it is. And that's what's happening. A huge piece of empathy is just sharing your calm, sharing your space, holding that space for people as they go through what they're going through, whether that's work or not. You can also do it online, by the way. You can FaceTime people and then like have them sit with you while you do stuff. I would not recommend like dishes and things that gets loud, but you can do other things, work and whatnot. And then understanding of routines and schedules and when things get messed up. I will tell you, I have a routine for everything. It's actually more of a system. Every single thing in my life has a system. The way I put my socks on, how I pick out my socks for my outfit every morning, what path I walk, every single thing has a system. And if those systems get messed up, it's a struggle. And many of you have been there in times when I've struggled and have seen that and participated in helping me kind of get back on track and giving me that space to take some deep breaths and get back to where I need to be. I've shown up to meetings frazzled, and people at the meeting have said, why don't you take a second? And then they've talked while I took a second to calm myself down, because mess ups happen. And I used to coach people on how to create executive functioning disorders in their lives for their kids or for themselves. I coached a lot of new teachers and we would talk about this frequently. The thing about, I don't like habits and routines, because habits and routines, first of all, are supposed to be like autopilot in your brain, and they're not for neurodivergent people. But you can't ever have a habit that you stick with 100% of the time easily. There's going to be times when things get in the way. So the goal isn't to have habits that are perfect. The goal is to have systems that allow for you to mess up, that allow for your day to get away from you, that allow for things to come up that you forgot and keep you, and then you get back on track. This is, again, going to be talked about in a minute, about how Ely is good at helping with that and helping people get back on track when their systems are messed up. Generally, though, everything that a person needs for executive functioning changes person to person. What my sister needs and what I need are wildly different, like complete opposite a lot of the time. And we were raised in the same household by the same parents who were both heavily versed in child psychology through their education degrees. And yet we are total opposites. And so when you know one person, you know one person. When you know that one person's needs, you know that one person's needs. These are general tips that help everybody. And in Ely, there's a way that this hidden inclusivity comes through. So that's what we're going to talk about next. What does Ely do? So Ely, most small towns in general, actually, have many of these pieces. Because as a function of being in a small town, especially one that is remote, you need to rely on each other. Whether or not you agree with all of your neighbors' thoughts and patterns and behaviors and their outlook on life, you still have a certain amount of reliance on everyone that exists within the community at some point. And as a function of that, it causes this like kind of strange acceptance of like, you are part of this community, even if I don't always agree with you. And you can see this in Ely because we have these layers of like who's pro this or pro that, or who does this and who does that, and what groups are you in versus these groups. And so you see these like little pieces where there's like splintered off places in community where you find deeper community and smaller community. But as a whole, Small towns are good about encouraging people to communicate and accepting what they need in order to be included. Ely in particular has many things. If you look around, you'll see a lot of neurodivergent people living in this town. Nature is a really big special interest for people who have ADHD and autism. It's like one of the top special interests. I never did say what my special interests are, but you can probably guess they're psychology and reading. And so that is pretty much what I do with my whole life. You should, and I mean like my whole life, like Christmas parties where I made people sign in and then took records. So I am not kidding. And then was upset when people would sign in and fake names. So like with autism, your special interests tend to be throughout your entire life. You may have a few of them that you kind of cycle through, and they all tend to be somewhat related. So, but with ADHD, you might go through these hyperfixations where 1 week you're learning about this, and then the next week you're learning about something different. Ely is great about encouraging that. They're great about talking to people and getting to know them, about encouraging them to find those special interests and those hyperfixations, and promoting how great they are at them when they've started to master it or when they have practiced it and want to share. Me standing here is evidence of that. I've been coming to Tuesday group for a year. It's one of my favorite things. It actually feels like it was designed for me, to be honest, because I love to learn things. And all I have to do is show up to this place that is one of my safe spaces because nothing ever changes in this building. And the menu like never changes. And so I always know what to expect. And I show up here and then someone teaches me something and then I go back to work. It's phenomenal. And because of that, it has allowed me access to other parts of the community as I've met people. Because this is the same every time. This never changes, which lowers the executive functioning demand. And that has allowed me to participate in other pieces. You can see that when Lacey talks about the Hello Neighbor program and how people come and have coffee with her or with the other volunteers, and then you start seeing them in more places. One of the best parts about Ely is that we see each other all over town. And once I started to get to know people here, and then I would see them at another event, it started to be easier to go to more events because then I knew somebody was going to be there that I knew. And I would have somebody, if I was confused or needed to ask a question, I knew who to go to and I knew who I could ask. It also meant that I kind of had like a built-in buddy if I was standing around awkwardly and not sure what I was supposed to be doing to participate, and then I could hang out with that person. We've all done that where you're like, oh, well, we want to catch up. I'll see you at this event, right? And you try to catch up in those times. And that's a big function of Ely community, is seeing each other at all of these different places all the time. And that's helpful when you don't know what to expect at some of the events. I haven't been to trivia night yet. I really want to go, but that's a newer event. And I know I'm going to see people I know there. And I know I could walk in and definitely be on a team, but the idea of walking in and not having a team pre-planned makes me nervous. So if anybody has a slot on a team, I will come hang out with you. Excellent. At the end of the day, though, everyone needs community and belonging. It's a human need. It's a requirement of our brains and bodies. We can't live completely in isolation. Our brains and bodies don't do well with it. Some of us need more community than others. Some of us need more time by ourselves in between community events. That's individualized and up to you. But we all need times where we are interacting with other people. Whether that means we go work at a coffee shop and we don't talk to anybody, but we just sit around other humans, or we go over to somebody's house and have pie and coffee. Whichever form of community works for you is the one that works for you. Ely has access to so many different types, though. There's a group for just about everything in Ely. And those groups are open to new people all the time. Like, you don't even really have to be directly invited. It's not like an invite only thing to most of the groups. There's community announcements, and then you can just show up. And learning those pieces as you come into community in Ely really helps you start to engage and realize that I don't have to wait for somebody to bring me. I can just go. And that those rules, those little rules that every community is different about, are helpful to understand and know. Because one of the barriers when you come from like a city where most things are invite only, or you need to like know lots of details or know somebody at times, there's not as much open community in a city as there is in Ely. You come here, you don't necessarily assume that you can just show up to any event. Another thing is the story. I have this up here more than once. All roads lead to Ely. Lacey said it because Ian said it to many people. And I realized as I was sitting in Tuesday group talking to somebody before it started, and they're telling me their story about how, they did this and then they got this degree and then they traveled here and then they got this degree. I'm not different. What I'm doing getting my PhD, what I'm studying, what I'm interested in, the activities I do are not different. Not to say that they're not unique, they're unique to me, but they're not different than how many other stories are like that in this town. How many of us have all kinds of things that we've done, all kinds of life experience and degrees and stuff that's happened in our lives. There's so much connection here. And if you listen to people's stories, you see all of these ways that we are similar and the ways that we can find connections with each other and highlight those and work together. And I know that there's times when it feels like things are always splintered and we can't figure out how to get that connection. But there are ways it shows up, like Tuesday group, like going to concerts, like trivia night. All of those places are little ways that this connection and the sameness comes up. And then the events. The events are advertised in a lot of different ways, which is helpful. And I know that that is something that is talked about by all organizations about how difficult it is to advertise events. And I think finding more systems that work better for the community will be beneficial. But having people tell you about it at Tuesday group, and then you go and you see a poster or you see it on What's Up Ely, and you get that repetition and you start remembering, oh yeah, I do have that event that I want to go to. That helps us all because there's so many events. How many people have come in and they're like, I'm new to Ely and I'm worried that I'm not going to have a social life. And then we all laugh and say, just wait. That's why, there's a reason we do that. So finding all of those events can be challenging, but it is a way that Ely includes all kinds of different people. Some more specific examples of Ely is I've been invited to so many things specifically at Tuesday group where I get here and then somebody's like, I want you to come to this specifically because I think you'll like it. Or I really want to see you. Can we get coffee this week? Right? We find ways to seek each other out. I lived in Chicago for 2 years, on the west side in Chicago. And Tim and I thought when we moved there that it was going to be so great and you're going to have all these things to do all the time. But we didn't, people are so busy and there's so many things going on in cities all over the city. And it's really actually hard to find that community. Whereas here, there's these built-in forums and built-in spaces where people create that. There's also things like all of these events year round, all the time. You can go to most of them. And so if you miss it 1 month, don't worry, it'll be there the next month. And the community announcements, Facebook groups, all of these different pieces. Ely has great ways of drawing people in. Once you get there, they're even better about it because they ask you questions. And I often forget to ask people questions. So I'm sorry to those of you I've not asked questions to. But they draw you in and you have these conversations. And I end up in the most fascinating conversations with people, which is a huge piece of community and allowing people to be who they are. So why should you specifically care? You're what makes the community work. The people in this room, the people that go out and they do the Hello Neighbor program, the events that you go to, the events that you plan, even when it's stressful, the bands that you're part of and you advertise. I know talking about the high school events every time that they're happening is a really big deal, and my teacher brain can go on a huge tangent about how important that is. But those pieces are what create that sense of belonging, that everyone deserves a place here. It's also finding niche connections and finding ways that people can feel heard and seen and participated. I've been telling people, because I wore this sweatshirt about my hobbies being excessive research followed by info dumping. I saw an ad for it on Etsy and I showed Tim and he said, you should order that right now. It describes you perfectly. And then it came in the mail and I wore it to Tuesday group. And many people read it and then said, that's perfect for you. And I felt really seen and cared for in that moment because they weren't saying it like it's a terrible thing. They were saying we love that you info dump at us sometimes. And that's a perfect sweatshirt. So I appreciate that. And so to, again, reiterate, all roads do kind of lead here. We all have such fascinating places we've come from and such interesting stories. And that's what creates this inclusivity and this belonging. Because like I said, if you've met one autistic person, one person with executive dysfunction, you've met that one person. And in this space, we're able to find other people we connect with, which leads us to this broader community. Lacey often brings me along to events, and that's allowed me to get to know more of you in a different space and in a different place and with different settings and things going on. And those are the building blocks of community. So if you're unsure, invite somebody out to something. Be like, we should go together because buddy system is great. But to kind of wrap up, enjoy this lovely picture that my dad sent to our family group chat this morning of White Iron Lake. He sends them every morning, which is another way of creating community. Some mornings I'm like, I don't know where he is and what's going on. And also it's too early. But I do always appreciate the photos because they are pretty. So thank you for giving me space and time to info dump at you. What questions do you have?
I have several questions, but I'll start with just one. Thinking of accommodation for people who have disabilities and handicaps, is it appropriate to give breaks to you in the course of the day so that you don't get overwhelmed?
Yes, I need lots of breaks. I take lots of brain breaks. My favorite brain break is to read a chapter of my book after I finish a task. It's like a little reward. Some people like eat a piece of candy or chocolate or something. I read a chapter of my book. But yes, breaks are important for everyone. My mom and I used to talk about this a lot. What's good for English language students or what's good for special ed students is generally good for all students. That applies here too. All of us need breaks and our brain needs time to decompress. So generally we should be doing that for everyone.
I have two questions. One is, you have trouble sleeping because of the
Yes.
inner talk. What do you do about that?
Well, great question. I have a lot of like systems and things that I'll do inside my brain to get myself to sleep. Like I'll try to focus on one train of thought. Some people like to count backwards, but I get really lost in that and then it frustrates me because I don't like numbers and sevens are kind of generally terrible. So I don't do that. But I will also listen to, there's podcasts out there called like Nothing Much Happens, which is just this mundane story that this lady tells about like these characters going through their day and doing basically nothing, but it's scientifically designed to help you sleep. I also like help with, I have like doctors and I'll see Sonia and things, and they'll sometimes help if I've gone a long period of time without really sleeping, which does happen occasionally. Most of the time, I'm a very emotional and I don't feel my emotions well because autism. And so my lovely husband will have me watch a movie like Big Hero 6, which will be guaranteed to make me cry. And then I will process my emotions and then I will crash and sleep for like 15 hours and it'll kind of reset. But yes, I have a lot of trouble sleeping.
Okay, a related question. I've known some people who hear voices. And,
yes.
Those are basically unwanted thoughts. If you experience some of your mental reeling as unwanted thoughts.
Yes, I do quite frequently. I call my, so I have like a core set of voices in my head that I hear regularly that I call my committee. We make decisions together as a group. Sometimes it gets loud and noisy and they disagree, but there are unwanted voices in there and those are intrusive thoughts. And I have learned through therapy not to listen to them and not to pay attention to them and strategies for getting them out of my brain. But they do get very difficult. We actually call my anxiety Herman, that's his name. And he's kind of a jerk sometimes. And sometimes I'll tell Tim, like, Herman is telling me this. This is the narrative he's saying in my head. And then Tim can address Herman. And it helps to kind of depersonalize it, that it's not my brain that's saying those things. It's this jerk that resides there sometimes. But yeah, I do have those thoughts. They've gotten easier to deal with over the years, especially getting diagnosed with autism and then accommodating myself appropriately did help quite a bit.
Can you say a little bit about the diagnostic process in terms of, because it seems that there are so many different degrees of this and many people are undiagnosed.
Yes. Yes, many people are undiagnosed, specifically women often get misdiagnosed and undiagnosed. When I was in my early 20s, I got diagnosed with bipolar disorder, bipolar type 2. They didn't do any psychiatric testing to do that. I had a really bad meltdown. My mom came home from parent-teacher conferences and I was in the midst of a very bad meltdown. And my dad, I don't remember what he was coming home from, but he came home after that to me having like an aggressive meltdown. And after that, I ended up at a psychiatrist's office and they diagnosed me with bipolar by asking me like a total of 10 questions. Looking back, was not a very valid diagnostic process, and I kind of regret following and listening to that. Over the course of the years, none of the medications worked. So when I switched psychiatrists, this new psychiatrist said, I am questioning whether or not bipolar is correct. And she sent me to a neuropsych test. So I got that neuropsych testing done. We were looking at ADHD specifically because my family members, some of them have ADHD. And so they thought, you know, there's a genetic connection. Maybe I have that. I don't. The other family members move much faster and like to be up and moving, and I like to sit in one spot. So that is not how I am. But I never actually saw the full report after this neuropsych testing happened because it was the beginning of COVID. So 3 years later, when I am very sick and my doctor's like, we need to investigate what's going on and everything, and she was filling out some forms on some testing we wanted to do, she realized some patterns in the mental health section. And I've been working with a therapist at a time, and that therapist was also indicating the same pattern. So they sent me to a new psychiatrist to get more neuropsych testing done. It's a nightmare of a process. Don't do it. And through that process, they all came to the conclusion that I was autistic through a profile that had been recently studied in the last decade of the hyperverbal hyperlexic profile. The hyperverbal was the new piece. We think of autistic people as not talking or being selectively mute. I do the opposite. The less I mask, the more I talk. And so that is challenging to get diagnosed. I also have a really high IQ, we learned, and that also threw a wrench into this because I am very smart. So it doesn't look like I have these challenges. And then they asked for a copy of that original report. And can they see what that report said? And I got a copy of that report finally, and that whole report said she's very smart, but she is not ADHD. She probably should get tested for autism. And then I was like, wow, that makes so much sense. And then I went through like a whole process after that of grieving and working with my new doctors and therapists. But yes, 2 different neuropsych and several doctors. Yeah.
This kind of led into it with diagnostic part. Daughter who is a therapist, cognitive therapist, is found field very discouraging. The medical field doesn't primarily stop for physical therapy.
Yes.
And so she hates her job essentially because of the nature of it. And so I guess my question was about your access to services and the potential effectiveness you kind of described of cognitive therapy.
Yeah, so cognitive behavioral therapy is what I primarily did when I was growing up, and it was somewhat helpful in terms of like the brain distortions. We have these cognitive distortions and these like filters that come on our brain. That was helpful. Cognitive behavior therapy is not usually very beneficial for people with autism because I intellectualize things. That is why I mentioned that Tim will make me cry by making me watch a movie that is guaranteed to make me cry. Because when I feel emotions, my brain goes, let's think about this from a high level, and then we'll put it in a box and move on. It's over. And so I remember once when I was little and I was sitting with my sister and we went to this like wolf park in Indiana, and then they did like a little hunt, and then she was upset because the deer died, and she was upset about it. And I was like, it's dead, Sarah. That's what happened. And she did not like that conversation much. But we have numerous iterations of that conversation, my sister and I. But the access was primarily because we had good health insurance through the school. And because I had a history of being in therapy from my childhood that allowed me access to some of these features. And because I was raised by parents who taught me how to advocate for myself very well. And so I was able to get access through that. I know a lot about health insurance now as a result. And I have learned other types of therapy that are better for autistic people, like dialectical behavior or eye movement desensitization therapy. But it is challenging. It's very hard. In fact, we did not file my autism diagnosis officially with insurance because being diagnosed as bipolar, even though it was incorrect, caused so many issues in me getting access to medical care when I needed medical care. And so when I worked with my doctors to get diagnosed with autism, we made the decision collectively that it was better for me to leave that off of my medical profile. I can talk about it. I just don't talk about it with my doctors. Yeah.
Hi, Jessie, thanks so much. I'm wondering how introversion can play within these different levels of neurodivergence. Personal experiences, realizing that the more introverted part of me is, and I'm using that definition of how do you recharge? Is it with other people or is it alone? That I can also often end up being isolated and feeling like I need people, but it's like, so
yeah,
I'm wondering what you've experienced with that or what you've seen in your research.
Absolutely. That's actually a major piece of my research and what I do with my executive dysfunction. One of my big pieces is called the emotional economy. If you've heard of the spoon theory, where you have a certain number of spoons and then everything you do costs a spoon, it was created by this woman who has chronic pain and chronic illness. I don't like it very much for neurodivergence because that's not really how neurodivergence works. Once you run out of spoons, you have to go to the spoon factory, which is like taking your meds and resting. But introversion and extroversion kind of operate similarly to how neurodivergence operates. We all have an emotional economy. And so you might wake up with $100 in your emotional wallet. Tim and I call them emotions. So you wake up with 100 emotions, right? Every single thing you do costs emotions. However, some things can give you emotions. So doing the dishes is not a task I enjoy. It's a sensory nightmare. I don't really like it, but I feel better when the dishes are done. So there's an upfront cost to me doing the dishes. I have to pay 30 emotions to do the dishes because it's going to make my hands feel icky. But once the dishes are done, I might get like $10 or $15 back. I might not get back full 30 in that moment, but I'll get some money back. You know, like going for a hike, especially in the winter. We all like to be outdoors, many of us, but sometimes the idea of getting all of the stuff on and like driving to the hike and doing all of that feels overwhelming. And we know it's going to make us feel better when it's done. And that's a good example of like, you might have to pay 10 emotions, but you're going to get 30 back. Introversion is similar because what you're doing when you want the human connection is you're kind of anticipating the fact that it's going to drain you. You know that it will, because you're right. Introversion and extroversion is about where you derive energy. If you're extroverted, you derive energy from social gatherings and you drain energy alone. But if you're introverted, this is tiring and you get energy by being alone. And so thinking about that emotional economy, what can you do to kind of offset the amount of money you're going to spend in the places that are going to be hard for you? That is why I mentioned that I get my Kindle in the morning because I like to read. That gives me money. So every morning I read at least a chapter of my book because then I might have woken up with 100 emotions, but now I have 130 and that's better. So when I look at my day, I don't plan my day necessarily in terms of tasks. I plan my day in terms of emotions. How much emotion am I spending? And how can I make sure that I'm gaining enough emotion to get through the day? If that helps. There you are.
When you think about planning, let's use the example of dishes. And so you're going to do the chore of dishes. So you go to the sink, you wash the dishes that are there, you dry them, you put them away. Well, what happens if you didn't clear the table in the first place? Do you go, because it's like you started in the middle of the chore. And beginning and end, do you go back and clear the table and start all over again, and that's a new chore? Or?
That is a new chore then, yes. If I did not clear the dishes, that is a new chore. However, I have a system. This is my favorite catchphrase. Sometimes I say fun fact and it's not really a fun fact, so beware. But this is the other thing. I have a system for that. And my system, if I'm the one doing the dishes, I will say, like, this is one of the reasons I love my husband so much, is that he does all of the cleaning because I struggle with those tasks. So I don't usually touch the dishes. But if I am the one doing the dishes, I go through every room in the house and pick up all of the dishes first. That's the first step. And then I organize them by type of dish because I have a system for how you do the dishes and how you clean each individual section. Part of the reason I don't sit in the room when he does the dishes is because I want him to follow my system. He doesn't. So we separate. But that being said, it is a new chore. If I were to skip a piece of that system because I'm stressed or overwhelmed, then that becomes a chore for later. And I spent other emotions on it and gained some more. I reward myself by reading a book or something and then go back to it later.
All right, I'm gonna take this opportunity to do a quick heads up about the future for Tuesday Group. Next week, we're hearing from Leah Wraith, who is an independent filmmaker whose films have been featured at the Ely Film Festival. So you may recall, actually, there was a short film on a youth robotics team that didn't play as anticipated. And so she's coming to speak at Tuesday Group next week, and we'll be able to kind of redeem ourselves from that technical error that took place and learn about both the young girls robotics team and Leah, this independent filmmaker. And then on September 24th, we're actually hearing from Travis Novitsky, who's an Indigenous photographer who's got a book called Spirits Dancing, The Night Sky, Indigenous Knowledge, and Living Connections to the Cosmos. So that's September 24th coming down the pike. And for now, we'll just bring it back to Jess with all the gratitude in the world. Thank you so much for sharing. We are so grateful to you.
Thank you.
See you all next week. Have a good Tuesday.